started. I'm Delila Owens, President-elect of CSJ. I'm also a faculty member at the University of Akron. Welcome to our panel, Decentering Whiteness, a School-Wide Approach. Thank you to all of our guests. Special thank you to Dr. Dollar Hyde, who's our president. I saw her here. Dr. Kent Butler, who's president-elect of ACA. So thank you for coming. At this moment, I'll turn it over to Franny for a second, and then I'll have the panel members just do a brief introduction.
Thank you, Dr. Owens. Today, in light of the events of the past week and the killings of Black and Brown youth, we wanted to start with a moment of silence. And before I do that, I'd like to say their names. Adam Toledo, 13, Trayvon Chadwell, 18, Anthony Alvarez, 22, Imambaran Sekep, 16, Dante Wright, 20.
Thank you, Franny. I'm going to have the panelists just do brief introductions so that you're aware of who they are. Dr. Melchor, would you like to get started? Just a brief introduction.
Sure. Do you mind if we just take a deep breath real quick?
Yeah, that's fine.
Sometimes I feel like there's moments where I sense certain energy or tension in a room, not necessarily bad tension, but just a little tight. So if I can use my introduction time just for that, as we kind of go into this short time together. So we can just take a deep breath in and out. Take another deep breath in and out. I feel a little better. So my name is Dr. Shaquilla Melchior. I'm an assistant professor and co-department chair at George Mason University. My background is in school counseling, and I'm pursuing my LPC now. I serve as the school counseling board representative for Counselors for Social Justice. And thank you, Dr. Owens, for having me on the panel.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Smith-Durkin. I am a high school counselor in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I am also a doctoral student in the Counselor Education and Supervision Program at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. And I am also a CSJ intern. Again, Dr. Owens, thank you for having me on this panel.
Hi, my name is Franny Neal. I'm a school counselor in Tucson, Arizona, and the CSJ communications officer. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dr. Owens, as well.
Hi, I'm Sharla Horton-Williams. I am from Texas. I am a K-8 school principal and also the co-founder of School Leadership for Social Justice. We work to advance the work of equity, inclusion, belonging, and community in schools across the country. I'm very excited to be able to share with y'all today.
My name is Dr. Toni Harrison Kelly. I am the other half of School Leadership for Social Justice. During the day, I teach 8th grade and been in education for about 20 years. And in the evening and every other minute I have, I'm fighting for equity through school training and workshops.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jill Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the American School Counselor Association. I've been at ASCA for more than 19 years. I'm a former middle school counselor, teacher, assistant principal, and I'm so very grateful to be invited to have this important conversation today.
Thank you, Jill. Okay, did we get everyone? Okay, I just want to explain just briefly the topic is Decentering Whiteness, a School-Wide Approach. Franny and I kind of came up with the topic together, the title together. I put in Decentering Whiteness. And I think it's important to explain that decentering whiteness doesn't mean that we hate white people. Decentering whiteness means that we've fought, most of us, for a very long time to decenter whiteness. It is white supremacy that we hate. So it's not about like hating white people, it's about getting rid of white supremacy, moving people of color from the margins into the center as well. So that is the whole point of this. I know I've gotten a lot of flack about, oh, that sounds racist. but it's really not about hating whites. It's about just decentering whiteness and bringing everyone to the table. So welcome, we're grateful to have you here today. We have an excellent panel. They have amazing experience. Special thank you to Jill, who's the Executive Director of ASCA. I think it speaks volumes that you came here today just to support and add input. So I want to start off, we have a series of questions. Those will sometimes lead into other questions that were not developed. But the first question is, I know sometimes my students say, what do you mean by like decentering whiteness? What does that mean? And then I want to talk about, I would like the panel, first of all, to talk about decentering whiteness. What does that mean? But I talk a lot about like the history of education, like closing the achievement gap. And some people will say, well, like some of your writing sounds like you're a history major. Like, why is the history important? So I'd like the panel members to talk about, first of all, like decentering whiteness. What does that mean in a school environment? And then why is it important to understand like where we've come from and how, like understanding our history and why we are at the place that we are today? So that's kind of a loaded question. So decentering whiteness, what does it mean? And why is it important to understand the history of education, especially for Black and Brown?
I realize that if we don't focus on the history, then we're going to place the blame in the wrong spot. So we're going to be fixing a problem that was not caused by the Black and Brown children we serve. So as I go through the history and learn more about redlining and all the things that affect the African-American experience, particularly, and the systemic racism that is in place, it helps me to shift my focus from fixing the children to fixing the system. And I think that for a long time, we focused on today's outcomes and not in terms or in light of the context. When we do that, then we are misled. And I think that it just takes the burden off of the student and places it firmly on the people who are running the system, which are the folks who are on the call now.
Okay. Thank you.
And it's important to recognize that we didn't just wake up in an inequitable education system. This is centuries in the making. During slavery, only 3% of Blacks were literate. By the time we got to Reconstruction, we were at only 30% of Blacks were literate. And to Toni's earlier point, it's not because Blacks chose illiteracy, it's because anti-literacy laws abounded. By the time we get to the present era, what we're looking at is decades and decades and decades of oppression and of inequity that has led to the place where we are today. And so when we talk about whiteness, now we're talking about all of the systems and structures that existed, not just to advance and advantage one group, but also to disadvantage and to oppress other groups. By decentering whiteness, what we're doing is saying, hold on, who said that these expectations had to apply to everyone? Wait a minute, who said that this has to be the way? Wait a minute, who said that these norms and expectations have to extend to every student group? Decentering whiteness is about recognizing, identifying what those structures and systems are that disadvantage certain groups, that advantage other groups, and actively resisting. And this is, we talk about anti-racism a lot, right? But anti-racism in and of itself is not enough, because it's not, first of all, it's not enough to just be anti-racist and say, I'm not racist. But the next part is, what am I actively doing to deconstruct those racist systems and structures that have historically locked students out of opportunity and placed them in positions of disadvantage?
Thank you.
And if I could jump in, I would add also just not only thinking about the history of education, but thinking about the history of school counseling as we think about the Industrial Revolution and then Sputnik, where school counselors were specifically about sorting and selecting students to go into STEM careers, to go into math and sciences. And so as we pondered the notion of gatekeeping and the school counselor as the gatekeeper, which has been a term used over time. I think I really hope as we move forward and school counselors are using data, looking at those systems, talking to principals and district personnel about these systems are not equitable. There is not parity in our district. And I, as the school counselor, I'm going to use my beautiful advocacy skills to ensure that all students have the same opportunity. And I just want to share something that when I had this conversation with somebody this past week, she shared history is a place of reference and not of rest. And that just really resonated with me as we continued to talk through this.
Thank you,
And
Jill.
there's one caveat I wanted to add in terms of history that I think we spend a lot of time talking about the value of representation, and representation matters. And the reckoning in the history is that our field is predominantly white women. And during Brown versus Board of Education, when they decided to say, okay, we need to integrate these schools, they also decided to remove the Black educators out of the schools. So when we're talking about the ways in which we need to reconcile history, the segregation of schools, that also is who is educating the children, and why is there kind of this persistent increase still, right, of our white educators, despite the country shifting into a more minoritized group. So even understanding from a historical context that we were removing Black and Brown educators out of the building. And by removing them out of the building, our children suffered. And then they still suffer today, right? Because our education system is still predominantly the dominant culture.
Excellent point, Dr. Melchor. I think that is a beautiful segue into my next question. When we met, Dr. Kelly made a comment. Dr. Kelly, I don't know if you remember this, but if you could like speak to that. You talked about like white women having to like take the lead on the change. So Dr. Kelly to mention that again, because I thought that was like pretty profound. Other people needed to hear that. And then it's going to lead into another question.
It was fun because that was a real life like revelation that happened right in front of your eyes. It was basically, I was thinking about how did we get here? And we got here, like Jill mentioned, because of the gatekeepers, right? The gatekeepers in the classroom who disproportionately refer Black children to special needs classes, and who disproportionately refer white children to talented and gifted courses, et cetera. And so, and the school counselors included in that, as you mentioned. And so if that's how we got here, then how we're gonna undo it is by having culturally competent white educators in the classroom. And so that's what reparations has to look like in education. That's the start of it, is making sure that every student has a culturally competent teacher in front of them, no matter their color. Like Dr. Melchior said, we can't get enough Black teachers at this point. There's just not, it's not possible for today's students to have, for us to educate, bring in, and put into service enough Black and Brown teachers to match them. And so the onus is on the white teacher to be able to create a sense of belonging, to make sure that their students get a fair shake, and that make sure they identify their own biases and prejudices so that they give every student an equitable chance at life.
Excellent point. So my next question is, how do you support a colleague who's stuck in the contact phase of racial identity? And these are individuals, and we know them, they're not necessarily young either, but like they don't believe that systemic racism exists. We should just treat people the same, we're just all human beings. How do you like get them to become, as my students would say, woke? How do you get them to wake up? That's just not the reality. It's never been the reality in America. So how do you deal with colleagues in the contact phase? Are there things that you can do to kind of help them move a little bit? Because it really is the racial microaggressions. If we're honest, I know that's it is the racial microaggressions that are played out against these students. And that is why you see this achievement gap persisting throughout the years. A lot of it boils down to the educators. And you do have some very, like educators who've been in the game for a very long time who are still stuck in the contact phase. They don't believe in systemic racism. If you just work hard, you That's the attitude. So what do we do?
I would love to respond to that as a longtime school administrator. One of my favorite quotes that I've heard from a school leader, from an educational leader, is Danny Steele said, leadership is not about leadership is not about changing people. Leadership is about creating conditions for people to want to change themselves. When I think about that quote in the context of this question, I personally, even as a racial and social justice advocate, am not in the business of waking up white people. What I am in the business of is creating space for the voices, for the lived experiences of people of color, of Black women, of Black children, of Black students, of Black men, of Hispanic students, for those voices to be heard. So I advocate I don't make people listen to training and facts and data about racism. What I do is, because we really are changed through the power of narrative. And so if we can create space for narrative in education, and we can create, and I hate the term giving voice, but if we can create space for those, for people of minoritized communities to have voice in spaces, then what we're doing is we are creating opportunities for those people who are stuck in that phase to experience some dissonance, much needed dissonance, for them to come to these realizations on their own.
I would like to add that we really like to focus on equity-driven data and data-driven equity, the other way around. So using their classroom data, your school's data, disaggregating it by race, the numbers don't lie. You know, it's easy for a teacher to say, no, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not racist. No, look at how happy my kids are. But however, what about your standardized test data? Which groups do better? What about your school? Which groups are getting to go to college? Which ones aren't? So I think highlighting the data and making it more about the numbers and what we're going to change there may be a point of change for behavior and beliefs for teachers and counselors.
If I may add, this question reminds me of actually how I met Dr. Harrison Kelly and Dr. Horton-Williams as well, was through one of their trainings, and it was on dismantling racism with PBIS data. And there was one quote that I'll never forget that they reminded us of, is show me your data, I'll show you your racism. And I think, you know, once you create the narrative, as Dr. Horton-Williams shared, going to the data is very important, and showing them this is happening in our school. So for example, at my school, Black and brown boys are more likely to have discipline issues 2 to 3 times more than their colleagues. And that's not okay. So we have to take a widespread look at that and fix it. So thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, I'll move on to the next question. I'm going to go with professional organizations. So what recommendations do you have for helping to decenter whiteness in our professional organizations? And I know Dr. Butler is here today, so, and Jill, but it really does start at the top. It starts at the top. I think it has to come from the top and then trickle down to everyone else. Historically, counseling has been white. I think we're doing a better job in the last few years with like showing diverse scholars and books and different things like that, but historically it has been like white.
And I'm happy, Delila, to jump in, and just from the ASCA perspective, and you know, I will say that over the past year, we have really made a concerted, very targeted effort to make sure we have resources for school counselors to do this work. In particular, the creation of the diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist that we made free to anyone who wants to participate in this. From our magazine articles, we're getting ready to release a professional school counseling journal special edition that's going to have, I think it's 19 articles, and it's on males in color in school counseling. But that said, and I want to be just very open and honest and vulnerable, we as an organization will make mistakes. It is not just this beautiful journey, but we're trying, I can say we're trying, I'm trying. And I think where I don't know if I get frustrated, but you know, that knowing that we're going to make mistakes and we're going to try and do better. Once we know better, we're going to do better. That if we can be, I think I said it when we met a week and a half ago. It's like, you know, we put our foot in this water and we do mess up, and then it's like we get our hand slapped, and it's like this recoil, and it's like, oh my gosh. It gives me all the feelings about then not wanting to do the work. So I love the fact that we're having this conversation so that it can be a collective process, a collective conversation, and just acknowledgement and vulnerability that it's hard work and we're going to mess up, but we're going to keep trying to do this work, because the fact of the matter is, for me personally, for ASCA, it's about what's good for kids. It is about what is right for kids. And therefore that work is all about that for me.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, when I think about the national piece, is just such a strong disconnection from the grassroots. So when we get to that national level, we spend a lot of time at the federal policy, our training, what resources we can give. And there's people on the ground who are dying every day that clinicians and school counselors do not do a good job at acknowledging, because the national organizations in their own way continue to be complicit. So when I march, there's something they say a lot, which is, who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. There is a disconnect from that national down to the person you serve, because there's something that's not happening with the clinicians on the ground as it relates to the national organizations. And it's such a huge disconnect. And I think that's why we see so many times when people are going through things and there's national conversations, we are left out of conversations. So there's conversations of like mental health being needed and trauma, but there's a lack of inclusion of us, because I think that there are things we are not saying, or there are ways in which we have been complicit and we have not reckoned with that yet, and have not said that in a very meaningful, tangible way. And then said, okay, yes, this is our history. This is what we need to do differently. And regardless of the fact that you have in ACA specifically, these Black leaders coming forward, your top heavy is still white. So till you start to break all of that down and come to grassroots, it will be sick, in my opinion, it will be cyclical always. And the change will continue to be slow and iterative, step forward, step back.
Excellent point, Dr. Melchor. So do you have any recommendations and I think we talk about this a lot, I 100% agree. There is a huge disconnect between our national leaders and the people who are on the ground doing the work. So is there a way to kind of facilitate like bringing everyone together so that the leaders hear kind of what's going on in the schools and the clinics?
Yeah, I think we miss the power of conversation and dialogue, the simple asking of a question. So many people who are clinicians are not, and even when I was a school counselor, I was not a part of ASCA. One, I could not afford it, nor did I really understand what that meant for me. So when we're trying to engage people who are doing this work, go to them. If we have state organizations, go to county and say, hey, this is what we're doing. Go to your local community service agency and say, this is what the national organization can do for you. What are we missing? Who are you serving? What do we need to know? We miss kind of that very simple communication across the lines. And I think that can be really powerful. Like, we have regions and states for very purposeful ways to do good work. So that would be one recommendation I have.
Dr. Owens, can I follow up on Dr. Melchor's statement? I think that one of the things that I know we're talking about national organizations, but I'm thinking about this in terms of systems and structures. And she just made a point that I was thinking about. She said, when I was a school counselor, I was not part of ASCA because I could not afford it. That is a systemic barrier to access. And that's something that is not just present in ASCA with membership, but think about, we also talked about Brown versus Board. It's important to understand the role that these systemic barriers play in accessibility, in representation, in access. So when Black teachers were removed from the classroom, not only were they removed from the classroom, but then these laws and structures were put in place to keep them from going back into the classroom. After Brown versus Board of Education, That's when teacher licensure came into play. That's when requirements for certain degree structures, degrees required were put into place. So we're talking about systems that keep us, these are the systems that hold up whiteness and white supremacy in national organizations, because the more people of color are locked out of opportunity to become teachers, to become counselors, to join national organizations, the less opportunity there is for that narrative that we're talking about, for those conversations, for people of color to join ranks of leadership. So it's important that as we think about decentering whiteness, we're not just thinking about what role do we play in our everyday context and our everyday roles, but also what role do we play in advocating for the dismantling of these barriers that keep us from being able to accomplish the goals of equity in schools.
Excellent point. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question if there are no other thoughts. Social justice curriculum and how that is infused in your schools, or if you teach, if you're a counselor educator, how do you infuse social justice in your courses? So how is that infused throughout your district, social justice curriculum, or is it infused throughout your school or district? Everyone's thinking long and hard, so.
I think the silence is very telling.
I was gonna say that means it's not. Okay. Shekila, you teach a social justice course. So you developed a course on social justice?
Yeah, so I was thinking, like, as a school counselor, I did not have that experience because of the area I was in was very rural, Southwest Virginia. But as a counselor educator, yes, George Mason has a counseling and social justice class that's required for all students. In that particular class, what was very meaningful for me when I took it on was starting with the historical context. I think oftentimes we are in a very hurry up of trying to advocate without understanding history, and also understanding the difference between, I do this a lot in school counseling class, there's a difference between social justice advocacy and advocacy for the profession. And I think so oftentimes when we say I'm advocating, that's not necessarily an activist, or if you're advocating, it's not necessary for a social justice issue. So kind of understanding that delineation. In the school counseling class, something that I really enjoy doing is the students have to do a 3-week unit based off of a podcast around where Michael Brown was shot. And it talks about the segregation of the schools, the lack of resources. And so I asked the students a question: if he had a better education, if there were more resources, if they didn't bust those kids in Missouri over here or bust them over here, could his life have been saved because there would have been a different community because the schools were strengthened? So that is something that we kind of do in that. But I will say, I think it's hard to infuse it because we are so new in our field of understanding it. You know, social justice is the 5th wave. That's the 2000s. So we're asking for a lot that hasn't happened for a long time. And
Thank you, Dr. Melchor. Dr. Williams, any thoughts on like how to, I know a lot of districts are not on board with infusing social justice, but I know you and Dr. Toni are experts. Any thoughts on like how to get this started?
I can gladly jump in. Or Sharla, did you have something?
Go ahead.
I think one of the biggest ways that we can help support social justice education in schools is to start better educating our history teachers. I think right now, history teachers are just indoctrinating students into the American way. If I were to quote all the history teachers that I ever had, it would be about working hard and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and you're not American if you can't make it to the top and start at the bottom. And that whole approach to history, our American approach to history, is counteracting any social justice lessons that we could possibly have. And so I think remediating and helping history teachers in particular to understand what they're doing, the damage they're doing, and to better understand the context of history from a racial lens, because of the whole racial erasure. The fact that I'm not, if I'm studying Texas history, for example, I'm not represented. It's all about the white man's conquest of my state, right? And so I think that a big starting point would be to at least neutralize history and make it more balanced as it's being taught in the schools.
And to add to that, along those same lines, so now what Toni's talking about is people, like the power that people hold in social justice. And I'm a staunch believer in people over programs. We could hire a curriculum, I mean, we could purchase a curriculum, right? Somebody could write a curriculum and everybody could buy it. But the work starts with the person who is implementing the curriculum, with or without a book, with or without a list of standards, with or without the teacher is the #1 curriculum. We really advocate for teachers for starting social justice work from the inside out. Who is the person in front of students? Who is the counselor that's engaging with students? Who is the principal that is making school leadership decisions? Who are the board members who are enacting policy? They are the social justice curriculum. They're the first line of defense in social justice. So starting from the inside out and helping all of these people to come to a clear and decisive understanding about their own racial and cultural identity. Who am I as a person? How does that impact and affect the way I show up in my work? How have I historically and currently either hurt or harmed the work, helped or harmed students in my work? And how do I undo all of that learning, that doing, in a way that's both safe and palatable? Because it can be really, really hard to start this work, because exploring your personal racial identity is not something that lots of white people do. We don't really have to, right? And so until you create this space for people to do that in a way that's safe, in a way that's meaningful, then you create the space for them. Once again, you don't change them, but what you do is you create the conditions for them to want to change themselves, for them to start to look critically and critically examine, what am I putting in front of us, in front of students? How am I engaging with students? Are my expectations and the work that, am I equitable in my practices, or am I oppressive in my practices? And that can be done, should be done, with or without a formal curriculum in place, because that's the first line of work in social justice.
Thank you.
When you said that, I thought about accountability, because we have so much evaluative measures in the school system, but there is a disconnect. Like, why isn't there some type of accountability or some type of evaluative measure that makes sure that you are doing right by your students? So we may give people these trainings, but then we don't evaluate them over time to see if they have actually changed from this kind of longitudinal standpoint. So they go do this training, they're like, wow, this is really great. And then they continue to perpetuate the norms in their classroom. So perhaps some type of accountability, some evaluative measure, like you were saying, if it starts with the people, then we also have to hold them accountable, also evaluate that to see that growth happening. If it doesn't, then you remove them. If we don't evaluate, we can't remove.
I love the focus on accountability, because as I was talking and listening, I was like, why are we leaving it up to the teacher to decide when and where they want to be equitable? So how can we put more accountability points in place at the state, city, district level to be able to say, okay, this teacher clearly does not have a racial lens that is supporting her students. Here are some specific remediations. And I think that we're so focused on testing that we don't see the connection between this environment that we're making and the test results. Okay, if your students don't feel belonging, don't see themselves in the curriculum, don't feel heard or seen, they're not going to perform. And so there's not enough emphasis placed on this foundational work of them just being okay with being in the school, in the classroom, and how that plays into getting them to score high on these standardized tests.
Excellent point. So I want to turn it to Jill for a second. Jill, the ASCA State of the Profession report, I'm always excited to read that. But so 2 of the requests from the school counselors in that report, and you can speak a little more to it, they requested more information on how to speak to children about racism, and then more like training on mental health.
Yes. Yes, and I was thinking about that report as we were, as the conversation was happening earlier, in that actually one of the statistics from the report that was actually very distressing to me in the question we asked in the report that was about schools' efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion and access. 36% of those who responded to the survey said that no actions in their district were being taken at all to address this. And that just, it surprised me and made me sad. But I will say, you know, student mental health and mental well-being has certainly become arisen to the forefront in the last year as we've talked about COVID, as we've talked about the dual traumas of not only COVID, but the Black Lives Matter protests and marches and the events that we have been witness to over the past year. So as we think about our students, as they may come back to schools, as they may come to us now, as they may come back to schools in the fall, that we really have to think about how we are going to support students and school staff, knowing that we've had these dual traumas going on. And the whole idea about mental health, I can tell you over the last year, most of the presentations, conversations, events I personally have been involved in have been around student mental health. And there are principals, superintendents, national organizations who very much want to understand and want to make sure that they have supports in place. And somebody talked about federal funding. And the fact is, you know, right now there is a lot on the table in terms of federal funding potentially for to provide student mental health and for as we think about school counselors, school psychologists, school social workers. And that gives us another issue in that, so let's say we have this massive amounts of funding that's put out there to the states to hire these positions. One of the interesting things about the school counseling profession that's happened over the past 2, 3, 4 years is that up until then, we'd never had issues filling positions. But over the last 2, 3, 4 years, there are not enough school counselors to fill positions. So as we have perhaps these additional positions being created in schools to address students' mental wellness and social and emotional learning, how are districts going to fill those positions? And if they're not school counselors or others who have the appropriate training to support students and to work with staff and families, what's that going to look like? So just throwing that out there, that's something that's probably, if it's not already on the horizon in your states, it's certainly the potential is there.
Thank you. Any recommendations from the panel about the Ask a State of the Profession report on just like helping school counselors, and I hear this from my students as well, helping school counselors have that discussion with students. I mean, students are affected just like we are, our clients. I mean, you see all of it, it's like every week there's something, and you cannot say it doesn't affect children as well. So I think educators, school counselors need to have those discussions about systemic racism, brutality in the police with individuals of color, and it's just not happening. So it's almost like you want to draw that correlation between districts not even wanting to address the issue and like students' mental health. So any thoughts from the panel regarding like how to move forward with helping school counselors understand how to address like racism and all of the stuff that we're seeing in the media with children?
Start with not underestimating the power that kids have and how much they really know. I think we unintentionally silence children in a school because we think you're here to learn, or we're the adult and you're just this smaller person. They oftentimes, especially this generation in the age of social media and TikTok, they know that more than us. And I think offering up the space to say, this happened, we're going to be in this room today if you need to talk. Also, you could spend time in your school doing a whole bulletin board of the history of your county, the history of race in your county, of your school system. You can tell kids, but specifically for school counselors, having been one, and I say this very respectfully, some of them need to come all the way back to grad school take another class on multiculturalism, take another class on counseling skills, take DSM, take substance abuse. You have to learn these things. It doesn't matter that you don't diagnose. It is prevalent in the schools. And because it's prevalent, you have to see it coming. If you don't see it coming, the kids are deteriorating in front of you, and you wouldn't even be able to refer accurately without that. So even going back to training, I think is going to be so powerful for school counselors. And if we say, hey, you can't come back to grad school, then ASCA can connect to somebody or connect to ACA and say, okay, here's what you need. These are common diagnoses in children. This is race-based trauma. This is what kids are going through when there's racial socialization in the schools. And then once we have learned those things, we can move forward in a more meaningful way, but there is a disconnect in the learning, a huge one.
Thank you, Dr. Melchor.
I would have to agree. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I'm going to agree with you, Dr. Melchor. I think schools often teach conformity rather than curiosity. And we talked before about like how majority of school counselors are white women. And so it's a difficult conversation for them to broach in regards to like racial trauma, systemic racism. And so additional training is needed. School counselors need to be vulnerable. They need to be able to say, kids, I don't know, you tell me what it's like for you. And then we can have that conversation. But I think it takes a lot of vulnerability, but then also additional training, because we often think once we're finished with our master's program, we've learned everything that we need to learn, where we haven't. There's still so much that we still need to learn. And then one multicultural class in your master's program, however many years ago, does not suffice.
Excellent point. Thank you, Stephanie.
When thinking about how to have these conversations with our students, even this week, I'm starting our career unit. And the book that I am reading with them is May Among the Stars, talking about Dr. Mae Jemison, the first African-American female astronaut. And in the book, it has specific instances of systemic racism. And we stopped on that page for about 10 minutes because I said, this is the most important page of the book. And we talked about it. And the kids got to talk about when they faced examples like that. We talked about what a microaggression is. Kindergartners can do that. And I think that, there's this idea that they can't. No, they know what this looks like. And they directly pointed out the color of the skin on all the people on that page. So I think starting the conversation, even as young as kinder through second, is important. So thank you.
I also think that Dr. Melchor came up with the linchpin here, and that is that we have to sacrifice our comfort. We can't just keep relying on feeling comfortable. You can't feel comfortable and heal racial inequities. You can't, those two don't go together. Even if you're a Black person, there's discomfort in having these very hard conversations with very young children, even with older students. So when are we going to decide that our comfort is no longer the thing that we're going to protect? We're going to protect the Black and brown children in our building. And I think that once we make that decision, the mistakes are going to come, but that's when we also learn how to do harm repair. We learn how to fix it. We learn how to do the best we can to build a bridge, but that's going to come after we make the decision to let our comfort be secondary to racial reconciliation.
Absolutely. Excellent point. Any other thoughts?
I think it's important. I want to add that, we're having discussions around how do counselors support the work of inequity with students on their schools. Well, and we've talked about this a little bit today already, but counselors, educators have to do the work first. And I think until we all start to dig into what does this work mean for me personally and internally on a very local and immediate and personal level, then and only then am I fully equipped. And I also think this goes back to another earlier point about humility, right? So I don't know. I may know a lot about counseling, but I don't know a lot about racial consciousness. I don't know a lot about navigating difficult conversations. There are some excellent tools and protocols out there. Glenn Singleton wrote an entire book and does work all around the country on having these courageous conversations about race in the specific educational context, right? And so Toni just talked about being uncomfortable. One of his 4 agreements is, number 1, speak your truth. My truth might be, I have no idea how to do this. I have no idea what I've done. That represents a humility that's necessary to be effective in this work. The second, what's the second agreement? Speak your truth, experience discomfort. Know that it's going to happen. That dissonance is necessary. We say as teachers, the learning is in the struggle, right? Expect non-closure. So I'm going to go into this, I'm going to have a conversation with these kindergartners, knowing that this is just one step in a very long journey towards racial consciousness and equity and social justice, right? And then also stay engaged. I can't bow out of the conversation when it gets uncomfortable. I have to stay in it both cognitively. I have to stay in it physically. I have to stay in it emotionally. I have to maintain my position in this conversation, because if I don't, that's what I call convenient allies, right? They are allies only when it feels good. They're allies only when it doesn't rub them the wrong way. They're allies only when what's happening aligns to their personal experience. And there's no place in the race for social justice, in the fight for social justice, for convenient allies. We have to stay in it. That is one of, these tools, these protocols exist out there. And the onus for being able to engage and lead these conversations is on every person that holds any role in education, that holds any role in serving and working with students to advance equity in education.
Excellent point. Excellent point. I think the emotional labor of racism, some people just don't want to get involved. It's just too much. But I agree with you in that in order to grow, you have to be uncomfortable sometimes. So thank you for that excellent point. I think in the essence of time, we'll open the floor. We have some distinguished guests in the audience, Dr. Butler, our president, Colette Dollarhide. Is there anything you all want to add to the discussion? Dr. Smith, Sean, I see Sean.
Great conversation, you all. I have nothing to add at this moment. I was actually sitting in the background, just listening and taking it all in. I hear the passion in all of the voices. Also have like some food in front of me as well. So I think I need to step away and allow those who are really bringing it to the fore to have their space. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Butler. Dr. Dollarhide, Dr. Smith, any thoughts?
I, excuse me, have really enjoyed this conversation. Dr. Melchior's points about the disconnect is very, very important. Is causing me to really reflect on a variety of places in my life, professionally and personally, in terms of connecting better with my students and the way that they're working in the field and challenging those structures much more directly. So I have very much appreciated all of the insights that each one of the presenters has offered. So I've been taking copious notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dollarhide. Anyone else? And I have one final question before we wrap up.
Thank you, Dr. Owens, for leading this. It's I'm always looking at the work from a systemic level, a macro level, because for me that's where it repeats itself. That's where it's maintained. So, what are we doing to address those macro levels? If nothing else, this last year should have taught us that the way we have been doing things doesn't work. I mean, literally, it doesn't work. And are we training individuals to be leaders? Or are we training individuals to be managers? I think we need to move to training individuals to be leaders in these processes. And with the biggest one being social justice and equity within the school systems. So that's where I'm at. I was going to listen, but somehow my fingers got to the keyboards and started typing things. I don't know how that happens, but this is a great dialogue. And I'm hoping this is just the beginning of a dialogue that's going to lead to actions, because every system that I'm involved in, I'm asking them and I'm actually demanding, if I'm a member, what self-evaluation have you done within your system, your organization, to get better at being social justice advocates?
Excellent.
And I'm going to keep coming back and asking that question.
Excellent.
So again, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Okay, my final question to the panel, and I'll open the floor on this one. Given that there's been so much in our country, I mean, since 2020, it's like one thing after the next. How do you instill a sense of resiliency and hope in your students and then also in your community, given like there's just been a lot going on and it does affect you emotionally, physically, but how do you instill that hope in your students and then in your community? In spite of everything that's going on, how do you keep everyone else up? We have to take care of ourselves first, but then how do you like instill that sense of hope in your student, resiliency and hope in your students? I see a comment in the chat. I'll open the floor.
I started this year talking about growth mindset with my students so that we could kind of start with that and practice that throughout the year. And I found them practicing that, and it's been really impactful in creating that hope and resiliency, I think. Dr. Melchor?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, really a highlighting and honoring, and I'll speak to my community specifically, of a Black joy. Y'all are late. Y'all are just now hopping on a train. And so when y'all hop on this train, you have a tendency to highlight our oppression, highlight our pain, highlight our death. And yes, that does need to be acknowledged, but it's centered sometimes in such a way that it further exhausts the group. There are times where you can highlight our joy. And so a lot of times, again, like when I march, we have had moments in the march where we stop and have joy, because the resilience is the overcome, which means if we have overcome, we also have joy. It's not just the oppression. And I think it's highlighted in such a way that we still feel boxed in, or we still kind of have this feeling of trepidation because there's such a highlight. And so you can't remove the fear. And then I think acknowledging that like what we've seen with our ancestors is so parallel to today. My ancestors might have said, yes, sir, no, ma'am, I'm just walking, minding my business. My generation is saying, my hands are on the wheel. I have nothing. I'm right here. Nothing has changed. All you have is social media. Now we're just asking you, if you are that bothered, then to do something different moving forward. So any generation that comes behind us will not live like us. I don't think it's that difficult of a concept. What is difficult is people's inability to humanize other individuals who are not like them.
That is exactly what I was going to share, Dr. Melchor, that instilling a sense of resilience in our students and really helping them to find, is rooted in helping them to find joy, excuse me. And that comes with, number one, normalizing Blackness. Number two, elevating humanity above all. And number three, finding and sharing stories of triumph, not just tragedy. We collectively, no matter what race, no matter what culture, no matter where you sit, no matter what your identities are, there are stories of triumph. And if we would find place for those stories, elevate those stories, if we would look at our students and see their collective genius, sometimes that requires, Toni wrote an absolutely incredible blog that's on our website, Finding Amanda Gorman, Finding the Next Amanda Gorman. Guess where she is? She's sitting in your classroom right now. that blog that she wrote was born out of a tweet that somebody said, oh, there are Amanda Gormans everywhere in the same schools that you call ghetto and underperforming. So the reality is, if we stop with the deficit language and the deficit thinking, and we start to see our students from an asset perspective, not from a deficit perspective. Different is not deficient. Our students may be, so it's up to us to look at the students in our faces, in our classrooms, on our campuses, and see their genius. That requires a level of cultural humility that lots of people don't have yet, because I only see genius through the lens of my own experience, through the lens of my own culture. But if you've ever heard a little Black boy spit rhymes on the playground, you know what genius is, right? Genius is not just Shakespeare. Genius is not just the classics. Genius is found, it's held within the lives and the voices and the experiences of the students that are sitting in our classrooms right now. But we've got to open our eyes to see it. We've got to call it out. We've got to allow them to express it. We've got to honor it. That's how we get them to resilience. That's how we get them to joy, by seeing who they are and making sure that they don't just feel safe, but they feel valued, no matter how they show up.
Absolutely. Amen to that. I'm excited. We can talk all night. It's been difficult being the moderator because they know I like to talk, but you guys are amazing. Any last minute thoughts from the panel? Decentering Whiteness, a school-wide approach.
I guess my only thing is, like, when are we doing this again?
That's a good question. The plan is to have this as a series beginning next fall. So we'll do this often. But we have a panel full of brilliant individuals. We met about a week and a half ago, and literally I could have talked to them until midnight. It's wonderful to listen to and talk to people who have similar ideas, similar energy. I agree, Dr. Melchor, 100% that we can't there's a lot of trauma around us right now. Trauma does sell, it's a big seller. People watch it, but we have to build on something else to stay psychologically healthy. You have to build on something else. So a special thank you to the panelists. Thank you very much, Jill, Dr. Melchor, Dr. Toni. Thank you all for just coming and giving your expertise. I look forward to in a few months, doing this again. If there are no other thoughts, Dr. Butler, Dr. Dollarhide, our guests, our founders who are here, thank you very much. We have a similar panel in June. With I forget what division, but we have a very similar panel. We'll send out the information. Judy Daniels, thank you very much, Dr. Daniels. She's one of our founders. Thank you for being here. Again, we'll do this soon. An hour is not enough time. We need 3 hours, and an hour is not enough time, but I know you all have busy schedules. So thank you again, and we'll see you at our next event.
Dr. Owens.
Yes, Dr. Smith.
Is it possible to stop the recording and just keep the dialogue, keep this open for another 15 minutes if people are able just to hang out? Because you know how we do. If we were at a conference,
absolutely.
we'd be in the hallway processing what we just experienced in this session.
And